The secret was never supposed to come out, not because it was dangerous in itself, but because it revealed too much. It peeled the skin off their narratives and exposed the nerve beneath every polished word they ever spoke. You weren't meant to be seen like this, not fully, not truthfully. You were supposed to remain a myth, a silhouette in the background, a version of yourself that made others comfortable. But truth has a way of bleeding through the seams. And once it did, once the curtain was torn down, they didn't just flinch, they recoiled. Because what horrified them wasn't the secret, it was who stood behind you when it came out. You, but not the you they remembered, the evolved version, the one no longer chained to guilt or silence, the one who doesn't need saving. Because you've become your own reckoning. What they thought they knew of you crumbled under the weight of revelation. You were always underestimated because you knew how to keep still while observing everything. Your silence wasn't confusion, it was study. And now that your truth has ruptured their comfort, they're left scrambling to rewrite the past to make sense of your present. They don't understand how you escaped the trap they built. They don't understand how the very thing meant to break you, the exposure, the shame, the betrayal, became the fire that reforged your soul. You didn't shatter, you shed. And the pieces left behind weren't broken, they were discarded. They called your strength a phase, but now they call it a threat. Because power, when reclaimed from the jaws of humiliation, becomes radioactive. You became untouchable by becoming unbearable to lies. They're not scared of your pain. They're scared of your clarity. You now speak with a tone that slices through excuses. You stare with eyes that no longer blink at manipulation. They can't distract you with half-truths, can't seduce you with nostalgia. You are no longer receptive to performance. And the ones who once protected you out of pity, those who wanted to feel heroic while you stayed small, they're silent now, horrified. Because the role of the protector only works when the protected stays helpless. You've rewritten that script. Now they don't know where to stand. They can't claim to defend someone who doesn't need them. That's what terrifies them. Not your story, your autonomy. There's a peculiar kind of chaos that follows exposed secrets. Not from the revelation itself, but from what it disrupts. Power structures, assumptions, carefully curated identities. You were once a placeholder for their projections, too quiet, too trusting, too easy to frame. But when the secret surfaced and your voice came with it, their roles cracked. The villain couldn't pretend to be misunderstood anymore. The savior couldn't posture without context. You unmasked everyone. And now, the ones who always had the loudest opinions find themselves tongue-tied, frozen, pretending they didn't know. But they did. They just didn't expect you to turn it into fuel. They thought you'd retreat. Instead, you rebuilt. Psychologically, you've shifted from prey to apex, not because of revenge, but because of restraint. The most terrifying kind of power is the kind that doesn't announce itself. You walk past them now and they feel it in their gut. The hierarchy has collapsed. They no longer hold the emotional leverage they once dangled like bait. You don't chase answers, you create them. You don't seek validation, you embody it. Your presence reveals the gap between who they thought you were and who you actually are, and in that gap, they lose footing. They tremble, because someone who rises without permission becomes a threat to every system built on silence. Who's protecting you now? No one. And that's what unsettles them, because the version of you that needed protection died when the truth was born. You don't require shields. You are the weapon. You don't require comfort, you've outgrown it. You're protected by your own discernment, your own standards, your own refusal to shrink. They can't control you anymore because you've made peace with being misunderstood. That's where the horror sets in. They can't scare you with exile because you no longer need entry. You've made solitude sacred. You've made independence an empire, And now they fear what you'll do next, not because you're dangerous, but because you're free. The secret didn't break you. It broke their illusion of you. It disrupted their convenience, because now, every time they see you, they're reminded of their role, whether they were the betrayer, the bystander, or the weak-willed protector. They thought the world would rally around your downfall. Instead, it watched you rise and looked at them with suspicion. You no longer walk in rooms hoping to be seen. You walk in and become the mirror, and they can't escape their reflection. That's why they avert their gaze. That's why they go quiet when you speak. Because guilt isn't a whisper, it's a scream heard only by the guilty. This is where your story diverges. You are no longer the one who needs permission to be whole. You are no longer asking for understanding from those who feast on confusion. You no longer share your wounds like invitations. Now you wear them like warnings. You don't bleed, you burn, and those who once thought they could stand beside you without growing will feel the heat. The secret was never the threat, you were. But now that you've emerged, now that you've dismantled the architecture of your silence, they see it clearly. You never needed protection, you needed release. Let them be horrified, let their eyes dart and their mouths stammer, because every time they remember what you survived, they're reminded of what they didn't face. Your courage exposes their compromise, your truth rattles their fiction, and your presence rewrites the rules they once lived by. You are no longer the victim in their stories. You are the author of your own. And this chapter? Ruthless, unfiltered, sacred. You write with venom and vision, and there is no erasing you now. They were prepared for the secret. In fact, they anticipated it. People like them always do. They account for fallout, for exposure, for the eventual unmasking of what was buried. Their entire strategy revolves around minimizing blast radius when the truth inevitably surfaces. They braced for that. What they didn't brace for, what none of them anticipated, was the presence that stood behind it. The force. Not loud, not theatrical, just there, watching, protecting, not with affection, but with purpose. The twist wasn't the revelation, it was the guardian behind it, and when the veil lifted, when the truth finally broke through the walls they spent years constructing, they didn't just see the secret, they saw what had been silently protecting it all this time. You, but not the version of you they projected, the one they underestimated, mocked, or used. This was the you they never studied, the one they couldn't predict, the one forged in silence and sharpened in isolation. You weren't hiding, you were housing fury that had yet to mature, housing intelligence that hadn't spoken yet, housing clarity that didn't need to scream to be understood. The secret itself was small compared to what surrounded it, the presence that had been guarding it like a lion guards a cub. Not to conceal, but to time. You weren't protecting the secret out of fear. You were letting it incubate. Because power that erupts too soon is wasteful. But when truth is unleashed by someone who's already accepted its consequences, it hits different. It doesn't ask to be heard. It changes the room. The force behind your secret wasn't defense, it was strategy. And that is what stunned them. Not what you revealed, but how you revealed it. They expected you to break when the truth came out. That's what they built their safety on, your collapse. They thought the exposure would dismantle you, that shame would silence you, but shame only works when you believe the lie, and you never did. You were just letting them think you did. That's what they never figured out. You wore your silence like a disguise, not a wound. And when the truth finally stepped forward, it didn't crawl. It arrived, surrounded by a force no one could name. It was never about damage control, it was about precision. You had calculated every step they didn't see. Because when you build yourself in secret, no one knows where your foundation begins. That's why they're confused now, because the secret didn't destroy you, it delivered you. They mistook your stillness for fear. They thought you were too fragile to hold something that powerful for that long. But some of us don't panic under pressure. We crystallize. You knew the secret wasn't the weapon, it was the bait. You let them become careless, let them grow confident, let them surround themselves with narratives that felt unshakable, and then you let go. You didn't drop the secret like a bomb, you released it like a curse. And the force that stood with it, that unseen energy surrounding your revelation, made it impossible to dismiss. You didn't just tell the truth, you brought judgment with it. They saw the edges of what you'd become and realized too late. You weren't just a survivor, you were the reckoning. Psychologically, humans are more afraid of intent than of chaos. Accidents can be forgiven, but strategy, that terrifies them. And what you did was not impulsive, it was surgical. The force behind the secret was your evolution, the years of becoming the very thing they prayed you'd never learn to be. Aware of patterns, of manipulation, of projection. You stopped playing dumb just long enough to let them bury themselves in the lie. And when you spoke, the truth wasn't just heard, it echoed. Because people can dismiss facts, but they cannot dismiss energy. And your energy didn't plead, it declared. You became the twist, not the secret, the protector, the embodiment of consequence. They thought the truth would be a moment, but the force behind it made it a movement. You didn't show up to explain, you showed up to close the chapter, to reclaim time, to extract yourself from every version of history they tried to write for you. And now they're scrambling, not because they didn't expect exposure, but because they can't recalibrate to the you that emerged with it. They see your clarity now and they know the old games don't work. You're no longer afraid of being misunderstood. You expect it, and you weaponize it. That's the irony. They feared the truth, but they should have feared your becoming. The truth was merely the torchlight. You were the fire. You were the presence in the shadows that no one accounted for. They thought someone else must have been guiding you. They still whisper, who helped them? Who's behind this? They can't wrap their minds around the possibility that you walked through the inferno alone and came out with this kind of force. But that's the difference between those who play the game and those who build their own. You didn't inherit your strength. You earned it. One scar, one silence, one unspoken truth at a time. They're not horrified by the secret. They're horrified by the realization that someone so underestimated carried something so volatile for so long and never blinked. They realize now that the shield was never a lie. It was your intention. You let them talk, let them guess, let them perform, because the real twist wasn't what they were hiding, it was what you were holding. And now they know you didn't just survive them, you surpassed them. And what shielded your truth wasn't fear. It was design. They thought solitude meant weakness. They saw your silence and called it abandonment. But you were never alone. What stood beside you was not some holy glow, not some angelic grace. What stood with you was consequence. Patient, cold, watchful. It didn't console you. It didn't whisper affirmations. It simply waited. Every betrayal you endured, every insult you swallowed, every manipulation you dissected without reacting, it was all being tallied, not by a divine force, but by something more dangerous. The ledger was kept by the version of you that refused to forget, that kept score not to seek revenge, but to ensure no debt went unpaid. And now, they're meeting that presence, not a savior, a sentence. You weren't walking with the light, you were walking with the echo of every line they crossed, thinking you'd forgive and forget. You don't carry justice like a sword, you carry it like a mirror, and the reflection it offers them is not distorted by time or excuse. It's sharp, it's accurate, and it cuts. They thought you would need someone to fight for you, But they didn't understand. Consequence doesn't fight. It arrives. And when it does, it doesn't beg to be believed. It doesn't knock. It comes in through the cracks they created when they underestimated your memory. You didn't cry out for help because you were alone. You stayed quiet because you knew something far more powerful was forming. You weren't waiting on allies. You were cultivating inevitability. And now, as you walk into rooms where their stories once reigned, it's not your voice that silences them. It's the presence of every action they thought had disappeared. Consequence doesn't have a heartbeat. It doesn't care about intentions. It only responds to patterns. That's why they fear you now. Not because you're louder, but because they can feel the weight behind your steps. You bring with you the aftermath they thought they'd never have to face. They used to look at you and see someone too soft to make them answer for anything. But consequence makes no apologies for softness turned steel. It does not require justice from the system. It becomes the system. And you, in your stillness, are now the face of it. They thought you were healed and harmless, but your peace is laced with precision. You don't seek confrontation, but you don't flinch when it finds you. That's the difference. That's what they didn't plan for. They should have studied the way you went quiet. They should have feared the moments you no longer responded. Because those were the moments consequence was being summoned. Not through rage, but through resolve. You weren't looking for closure. You were calculating your exit. Not just from their story, but from the version of yourself who ever tolerated their presence. You didn't ask for retribution. You became what happens when disrespect goes unchecked too long. They now sit in the aftermath of your departure trying to understand where they went wrong. But they never stopped to think that your silence might be the last sound before the impact. What they thought was grace was actually the grip of something older, something earned, something You were never guided by light. You were followed by the ghost of every moment you swallowed pain and smiled anyway. And now those moments walk beside you like shadows with teeth. That's what they feel when you enter a room. Not just your presence, but the gravity of all the lines they crossed thinking you'd never evolve. Consequence isn't theatrical, it's methodical. It comes when it wants, and it always collects. And it doesn't care if they're sorry. It cares that they were warned. Through your withdrawal, your detachment, your steady climb away from their nonsense. You didn't threaten them, you outgrew them, and that's always the deeper punishment. Watching someone they tried to break become the thing they now fear standing next to. There's no heroism in what you've become. There's no martyrdom in your silence. You're not playing the savior. You're not waiting for them to change. You've simply stopped protecting them from themselves. That's what consequence really is. The removal of insulation. They now get to feel the full weight of their own decisions. No filter, no cushion. And you're no longer absorbing impact. You're reflecting it. Every time they try to twist the narrative, your existence reminds them of the version they can't erase. The version that survived without them. The version that walked away, not as a victim, but as a verdict. Let them try to reconstruct the past. Let them attempt to rewrite history through whispers and manipulation. But what they cannot escape is the living monument you've become. You're not a person in their story anymore. You're the consequence of every chapter they wrote thinking you'd never find your pen. And now their stories collapse under the weight of the one you're writing. Not in anger, not in haste, but in unshakable clarity. That's what terrifies them. Not the truth, but your calm mastery of it. You don't need revenge. You don't even need their acknowledgement. Because consequence doesn't wait to be recognized. It just shows up. On time. Every time. They used to joke about your loyalty. They used to mock your patience. But both were warnings in disguise. Loyalty, when misused, becomes detachment. Patience, when abused, becomes distance. And once both are gone, the person they knew is gone too. You walk now with absence like armor, and what they see is not regret, it's consequence. It wears your face, but it speaks in silence. And the louder they try to discredit you, the more their desperation betrays them. Because consequence doesn't need defense. It is its own proof, and your presence, unbothered and unmoved, makes their guilt ring louder than any confession. They expected justice to come gently, wearing white robes, carrying a scale in one hand and mercy in the other. They expected something elegant, something noble, something sanitized enough to let them sleep at night, even while they bled others dry by day. But justice doesn't always arrive like a saint. Sometimes it shows up grinning, not cruel, but clear. Wearing no mask, cloaked in no illusions. You didn't come with divine wrath. You came with precision, with scars stitched into strategy, with memories that made you immune to pity. That grin they now flinch at? It's the grin of someone who has waited, watched, endured. It's not the smile of forgiveness. It's the smirk of inevitability. You didn't become justice. You unleashed it. They told themselves for so long that karma was mythical, that truth was bendable, that people like you disappear after the damage. They counted on your silence, on your withdrawal. They framed it as your defeat. Mistaking distance for defeat is a common mistake among cowards, but what they never accounted for was return. Not the kind that begs, not the kind that explains, the kind that doesn't speak at all, just grins. Because justice doesn't always speak, it just arrives. And when it does, it doesn't knock, it walks in like it owns the room. Because it does. Your grin was the first thing they noticed. Not angry, not bitter, just calm, unbothered, too still for them to understand. And that disturbed them more than rage ever could. There's something eerie about the justice that doesn't shout, that doesn't need to prove a point, because it means the war is already over. And that's what you brought. Closure, not in word, but in presence. You weren't carrying vengeance, you were carrying the mirror, the one they avoided for years. And when you placed it before them, you didn't have to say anything. That grin, that silent, sharp grin, said it all. This is who you are. Justice didn't come to cleanse, it came to reveal. You didn't seek revenge, you were the response. And your calm, your grin, your energy, that was the echo of everything they did when they thought no one would remember. They remember now, not because you reminded them, but because justice has a way of making memories hurt. You see, pain doesn't just return, it multiplies in reflection. They now feel what you once buried, and your grin, it's not gloating, it's survival. It's your crown, the quiet satisfaction of someone who waited for time to do what words couldn't. They don't know how to interpret your joy. That's the part they fear most, that after everything, you're happy, and they don't understand how. They thought justice would arrive to scold, but it arrived smiling, without apology, without grace, without need for dialogue. You didn't come to debate. You came to watch them stumble beneath the weight of their own story.